Bobby, previous Genki Bowls have had no lack of surprises.
Of the nastiest sort, Zach, and this year will be no different.
Time sure does fly. Almost 10 years have passed since Violition, yes, those of hallowed Red Faction fame, released the very best Saints Row title that was all about balls to the wall chaos, wacky extreme humour and incredibly cheesy and bombastic set pieces. Your only aim throughout the game was to be, well, a big, yeah.
Great action.
But from the opening bank heist, annoying method acting and stocking and suspender guards, you never know quite what to expect. Be it irate gun-toting grannies, mass murder on rooftops to aeroplane travel of a very different kind. This game takes nothing seriously, especially itself. It never jumped the shark, but it sure as hell ate the bunny and the box that it came in. Now once past the opening story build, you are free to wreak havoc on the city and build your empire once more. Or simply chase tail in true Benny Hill fashion. Or just practice your WWF takedown. It was and still is a real joy to play that ramps up the crazy. Nothing in the remaster is any different from that point of view. The gameplay, the controls, the story segments and flow are identical and I love it. But this is not the same game that launched 2 years before GTA 5 in 2011, which also opened with the bank heist. No, this is a remaster that has not been thrown out of the top floor, but a creation of the Spirasoft studio, which has been building a bigger and bigger portfolio of work through collaborations with other studios. Porting and asset creation is something they specialise within, working with Warner Brothers, Codemasters and Ubisoft currently on the new Valhalla Assassin's Creed due later this year. They would have been commissioned by Deep Silver to port this across to PC, PlayStation and Xbox consoles, taking the core game engine, scripting as is, but the models and assets are partially replaced or updated alongside brand new ones in parallel with engine improvements across the visual plane. Now first up is its resolution, with the PS3 version here sporting a native 1280x720p resolution alongside a V-synced but unlocked frame rate, something we see here as an option as well. Other improvements aside, this now resolves to a native 1920x1080 on both base consoles, in conjunction with a temporarily accumulated AA to soften detail to the benefit of those stable edges, specular and alpha details. It's a huge increase over the decent for its day Quincook's AA, which is, as the name suggests, 5 samples per pixel for a super sampled output that delivers close to 5 times MSAA but at the cost of 2 times, and that's simply as each pixel shares sample points across the 4 edges and those neighbouring pixels. It is no match to the 2.2% pixel increase and TAA though, which really demonstrates the leap this generation has made in IQ for those still in doubt. The net result is a pleasing, more refined image that does not break up and suffer sub-pixel noise to anywhere near the extent of the last generation. Obviously the Pro and the X push this even further, with an identical 77% improvement on top of that, and an identical resolution of 2560x1440, alongside that clean TAA post sample to present crisp, sharp edges with no obvious distracting aliasing across them. It can still have occasional missed points though on long edges, but by and large this is a world away from the PS3 and 360 version, which was the better of the last 2 generations in the PS3 version. Now image quality though is much better, and it's more than just pixel counts. Here is where the studio have spent the majority of their efforts, and it really shows. Replacing core assets and texture composites in the game, from complete model creations in the main characters to material system itself, which now implements a specular based lighting material model. It is PBR, but that covers a huge gamut, and the aim here is still hyper realistic, and as such very little looks real or close to the best we have seen this generation. And that's not its aim though. It's more so a cartoonishly caricature focus in nature. From skin tones, clothing quality and even the lighting, this is as far from real as Dorothy was from Kansas, which is the perfect for this pulp fiction style it goes for, and it achieves an exceptional balance of straddling the original look with a modern twist. Embellishing the enhancements are screen space ambient obscurance, which looks to run half resolution, with those telltale clamping signs as they disappear and reappear when occluded from foreground objects, just as I demonstrated actually in my Unreal Engine 5 demo analysis last week, or the week before, whatever it was. Now these strong halos appear around objects or corners that contact to bring them more depth and solidity to the scene. Now materials also use screen space reflections now, along with cube maps and planar at times, which were largely absent or heavily reduced in the 360 PS3 versions, as I've already shown here. The textures are also increased in quality, with even new ones at times, specifically during the opening heist. Now this complements the lighting upgrades in Crepuscular Rays, which are world and not screen based. Fog volumes, enhanced motion blur and depth of field, increased in traffic and pedestrian density, and full HDR rendering prove that the title has been given lots of care and attention to bring it bang up to date, and it succeeds. The comparisons to the last generation show the leap in frustum scale in the distance, the better LOD system, and the grass is now fully grown, whereas before it was a mere patch on this. Now as far as remasters go, they have done an excellent job on improving the package to look and feel bigger and fuller across all sections. Even though you might still see the roots, this is a much better looking game overall, and almost convinces you this is what it looked like until you go back and compare the two. But it's not all rosy in the world of remasters, and this is always the limitation that this and many of the teams have based on how much you want to remaster the original game. And that's largely based on the same freak triple constraints that hit any project: quality, time and cost, or in this case, scope and schedule. This was largely, I would imagine, a 12-month project, and they've done an exceptionally good job, but the seams do show, and the original generation title doesn't as much pop in as pop up. Cars can be popping into and out of view very close to your distance as you look off. You can see them appearing and disappearing, just fading in and out on that dithered sample pattern. Grass and shrubs grow right in front of you as you drive, and even worse so when you're in a plane. Lights fade in and out very close to you, and there's almost no dynamic shadow casting lights anywhere, not even on guns, which is a little bit of a shame and things that they could have added in. There's also differences between the platforms and errors. You can see here an additional point light that's been put in place, which creates an additional filter, specular highlights and bloom, a pixel shader bloom that's not present on the Xbox consoles at all. And this happens again outside when they put that additional pixel shader bloom filter over the outground objects. And this can happen on both sides of the fence. And then in addition to this, there's other errors, such as the way the light don't cast any shadows on the cars, but when you move the frustum around, they actually pan out and move with the frustum, therefore they look like they're casting shadows from where your camera is rather than the car itself. And these errors appear on the Xbox and not on the PlayStation platforms. There's some poor sprite based lens flare effects that are frustum aligned and thus spin as you move the camera around. Textures are horrendously mixed though, and that's the biggest weakness I find because of the strengths elsewhere. Some are absolutely excellent, and others look like they were ripped straight from that PS3 Blu-ray disc. Again, it's a minor gripe, but it's a jarring contrast between the great work elsewhere and the ones that have clearly been left as they were and just stretched across the newer vertices. And in addition to that, some of the improvements to things such as the particle system are not always for the better. As you can see here between the PS3 original and the new version here, it looks far less debris, far less parts breaking off from the wall, and actually it looks a lot flatter when you compare the two side by side. But this is always going to be the challenge of a remaster. You can't get everything right. But the biggest impact I think across the board in terms of making the game feel more modern is there's still absolutely no day and night cycle, with you having to live and endure endless night or day depending on your load look or certain missions forcing you to go through. And ultimately it plays like an old game in a modern skin. All the old errors of AI, clipping, collision, getting into cars, pressing square, triangle, getting in and out, all those errors stay present and correct as they did in the original. And that's really out of the team's hands unless they made drastic changes to the code and the engine, and that's not really viable. Now ragdolls persist, and this is actually quite nice, and the destruction still feels more modern than many other games with its havoc based approach, and even now it still creates most of the laughs and impact of combat, but more could have been done here. Like I say, the day and night cycle for me should have been possible across the fixed points, and some blending or enable an in-game shift via a second sunlight segment just to break up the monotony the city and those prolonged fixed lighting sections can have. But like I say, others may not really care. It's one of the areas I would have spent a little bit more time on though. Do not get me wrong, this is still a much better update than many others, but beyond a new lick of paint that missed a few spots here and there, this is still very much limited by the same core engine and code from Volition's best Saints title. Not bad company to be fair. And this is also true of the performance, with it utilising the multi-core design of the Xbox 360 Xenon and the PS3 Cell SPUs. It was using 6 threads likely to keep the relevant GPUs fed, and it may also be using an equal amount here, or most likely the extra 7th and a little bit, to keep the AMD graphics portion as equally fed, with at times an unnerving level of equal performance, as shown here with the opening sections on the Xbox One S and the PS3 opener. With the last generation version also running an unlocked frame rate, it allows us to test it and just how well it runs against the current generation, which both also have an option to untick it and run it uncapped or capped at 30 FPS, and that means that you can use this as a benchmark to see just how well each machine runs the engine. Now here, comparing the PS3 to the Xbox One S, which is the lowest level of the current consoles, and the PS3 was the lowest level of the multi-platform consoles back in the day, you can see how close they are. Yes, I know visual effects, resolution, all those kind of differences, but it's all relative to the era. You can see that they run and hover around 30 to 40 FPS. The Xbox One S is obviously overall better than the PS3, and it is running a much better quality resolution, but it's not a huge leap over what we saw, and at least it was V-Synced back then, which the 360 wasn't, and it tore horribly, as I recall back in the day when I first saw it on my mates, and I thought, well, that's not one I'm going to play, and I bought it on the PS3. But the performance is very close, and I would recommend that on the Xbox One S you cap it at 30 FPS, because it really doesn't get anywhere near close to 60 FPS to be an option. And that kind of carries over to what we see on the PS4 as well, in further stressful sections using more of the impact of the engine itself, the streaming and those LOD systems and collisions and particles. It does ramp up the interfaces a little more, so therefore you feel that input time slow down, you feel the performance rate drop, and it's not close enough to 60 FPS often enough for me to really warrant that as an option on the PS4. It's great that it's there, and I absolutely commend the team that that option is there. Some may prefer it, and that's absolutely fine, but for me, the inconsistency on these base consoles is just a little bit too much away from where I would prefer the target to be. And it's not a drastically different tale for the two premium consoles, although one is much better than the other. Unsurprisingly, the Xbox One X does a much better job here by delivering much more consistent frame rates up to 60 FPS far more often than the PS4 Pro does, because it doesn't hit it at any point in my tested sections. If you stare at the sky, it will do it obviously, but that's about it. And that really comes down to the GPU, not the CPU. This game is not CPU bound at at all most of the time in the issues that we're seeing on screen. Most of the issues are coming from the GPU, and that's because, as I've mentioned before, the PS4 Pros run in identical resolution and settings to the Xbox One X, but it not only has less RAM, which affects it, it has a much smaller bandwidth, and this game uses a lot of effects, a lot of alpha effects, a lot of particles, a lot of pixel effects, film grain, bloom. All those effects are really swamping the bandwidth, and that's what's limiting the PS4 version. And the Xbox One X does a good job of really delivering very close to 60 FPS throughout the opening sections. It's very close indeed. But once you get into the game, and everyone remember the weird science level, another hark back to the 80s classic movie, you can see performance dip drastically. Here, looking at the PS4 running this section, it can drop down to the 20s in points. The Xbox One S can go even lower, into the 15s I've seen it drop, and that is not a great place to be, and that's one of the reasons why the consistency is the issue, and I'd cap it to 30 because these sections feel much better. But you run this on the Xbox One X, which is by far and away the best version of all versions in terms of running performance. It also can drop into the 20s at times due to this heavy loaded section. And that means that, again, that if you are really affected by frame rates, then I would definitely stick the cap on and leave it locked at 30, which it does pretty much 100% of the time, much better than last generation versions. But for me, I would do that on every single console aside the Xbox One X, because this and some other sections when you're driving across towns and other heavy emissions, it generally feels in the 40s to 50s more often than not, and that makes it feel more consistent, and it improves those input times, which makes the game more enjoyable overall. So in terms of the pecking order, if you're going to buy this, then the Xbox One X is the best version, closely followed by the Pro, and then the PS4 and the XS are very close in terms of image quality and overall presentation. They just suffer a little more in terms of that performance, but capping them to 30 gives you a lock solid smooth frame rate with motion blur, which aids the 33 millisecond update and makes it feel smoother than what you would normally imagine of a 30 FPS open world driving title such as this. But by far and away, the Xbox One X does a much better job of delivering that 60 FPS target that it aims for. It's not consistent, it's nowhere near a lock 60, no version is, but it's the one that has the most realistic option of turning that on and really playing the game without any issues. And that's how I've played most of the footage you saw here, because it actually isn't that bad other than those heavy sections I've just covered. The Pro suffers more, and on general terms it's around 12 to 10 FPS lower FPS across the board. As you can see, the averages work out around 42 to 55, so it's a very high performing title on the X due to the fact that everything else is pretty much identical. That bandwidth limitation and that memory allocation is probably the biggest limit here, and why we're seeing such a big shift in certain points of the title. Anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this and everything else that I've put together, and I'll catch you very soon with some more gaming and next gen action on the next one.
You think we got enough guns? No, sir.